Since Sakusa and Atsumu went to Osamu to find out more about Yachi, several days had passed. Atsumu had told Komori where Yachi might be now, and Komori was pulling out all the stops to find her. In the meantime, Eiko's father had contacted Sakusa, saying that he needed him urgently for one or the other job in the next few weeks. This meant night shift for Sakusa. Now that Komori was fully recovered, it was up to him and Atsumu to protect Aiko. Sakusa saw his friends, if at all, only in the evening before he went to Eiko's father. In the morning he usually came back around 5 or 6 a.m. and then immediately went to bed because he was too exhausted by then. Usually everyone was still asleep, but today Atsumu was already awake because he couldn't sleep anymore. Atsumu was just in the kitchen when the front door opened quietly. He peeked into the hallway and saw Sakusa, who looked quite exhausted. Atsumu smiled weakly. "Omi." Sakusa was taking off his shoes and flinched when Atsumu addressed him. He looked at Atsumu with tired eyes, his heart beating strongly as he saw the blonde boy wearily smiling at him. "Achu already up?" Atsumu yawned and walked towards Sakusa, his smile never fading. Yeah. I couldn't sleep anymore." The two walked towards Sakusa's room and continued talking for a while, Atsumu updating Sakusa. Sakusa went inside his room while Atsumu stopped in the doorway and leaned against it with his arms folded. "In any case, Komori is close. We might possibly be heading north in a couple of weeks." Sakusa nodded and dropped into his bed. "Komori is good. He'll find her for sure, and the fact that she's so hard to find is sign enough that she's got something to do with Seki." Atsumu lowered his eyes and sighed but remained silent. Sakusa was right, even if he didn't want to hear it. "Hey Achu." Atsumu's gaze snapped towards Sakusa, who by now had straightened up leaning on his elbow and was looking at Atsumu. "Huh? Do you want to keep me company for a little while longer?" Atsumu's eyes sparkled. He glanced at Sakusa, who moved to give him some space on his bed and pointed to the empty spot where Atsumu should sit. Atsumu blushed a little, his heart beating faster and faster. "Shouldn't you be sleeping?" Sakusa sighed. "I have too much on my mind. It's taking me quite a long time to fall asleep lately." Atsumu frowned and pushed himself away from the door frame to sit on the bed with Sakusa. Sakusa straightened up and placed himself next to Atsumu, his gaze fixed on his fingers that he was nervously playing with. "Do you wanna talk about it?" Sakusa frowned and cleared his throat. "I don't know." Atsumu raised his head and put it back in his neck. He leaned against the wall and looked over at Sakusa from the corner of his eye. He pressed his lips tightly together. Of course, he could already guess who it was about. Yesterday was Yuki's birthday. Atsumu's eyes snapped wide open and he tilted his head to Sakusa, who he looked at more horrified than he wanted to. Sakusa gladly didn't take his eyes off his fingers. He put one arm on his bent knees and ran his other hand through his hair. He sighed. Not that you'd care." Sakusa winced as he suddenly felt Atsumu's hand on his back. He looked into his eyes and was given a warm and somewhat pained smile. "Tell me about him." Sakusa's eyes widened and he looked at Atsumu a little confused and anxious. His expression softened again however, as Atsumu continued to smile at him. "Were you at his grave? Did you congratulate him?" Sakusa shook his head, clutching his knees and gazing into the emptiness of his room. Atsumu's hand was still on Sakusa's back. "No, he has no grave. He was cremated and then we spread his ashes in the lake." Sakusa smiled faintly. "He loved it when we were there. Most of the time though, we were just fooling around." Atsumu smiled faintly as he saw the corners of Sakusa's mouth lift slightly. "Then you were at the lake?" Sakusa nodded, his gaze lowered and he started to look a little sadder again. Atsumu had a sinking feeling in his stomach. On the one hand, he wanted to help Sakusa and was interested in what kind of person that Yuki was, but on the other hand, he really didn't want to know anything about him. Atsumu sighed and pulled himself together. What was Yuki like? Sakusa hesitated for a moment, leaning back, which made Atsumu take his hand off Sakusa's back. Sakusa looked Atsumu in the face and was met by his big honey-colored eyes glaring at him. He smiled faintly and then focused his gaze back on his hands, which Sakusa had brought in front of him to fiddle with. He was nervous. He was cheerful. Happy, always in a good mood, actually. He laughed a lot. Sakusa paused for a moment, smiling a little himself by now, though it carried a hint of anguish. Atsumu looked at him skeptically, but Sakusa kept on speaking quietly, almost whispering. I loved it whenever he laughed. The way Sakusa spoke about Yuki made Atsumu shiver. He could tell that Sakusa still had strong feelings for him. He was the one who got me through all my worst times. I could trust him. I felt so safe and secure with him. Yuki was the only one who really understood how I felt. When we were together, everything felt so much simpler and easier. He was sweet, caring, lovely. Sakusa paused for a moment, Yuki's face appearing again and again in his thoughts. His heart was hammering, remembering all the beautiful moments he had with him. Atsumu gulped. You just loved him? Sakusa flinched and immediately turned his head to Atsumu, who gave him a warm but somehow tortured and sad smile. Sakusa blushed, turned his head away from Atsumu again, and now lifted the corners of his mouth a little himself. Yeah, I guess. Sakusa's smile quickly faded however, and he frowned. He swallowed to get rid of the lump in his throat. Atsumu looked at him, also frowning. Pretty stupid, huh? Atsumu could see the corners of Sakusa's eyes filling with tears, which Sakusa immediately wiped away. His heart ached. He really didn't want to see him in this condition at all. In the end, I don't even know if he was ever serious about me. If he really loved me. I mean, could he? All he ever felt for me was hate. Sakusa flinched and his eyes widened as he felt two arms wrapped around him. Atsumu pulled him into an embrace and clasped his hands behind Sakusa's back. His tense body loosened and he buried his head in Atsumu's shoulder. A single tear made its way down Sakusa's face. He exhaled deeply. Sakusa didn't know if he was imagining it, but he could have sworn he could feel Atsumu's heartbeat. It was racing in the same rhythm as Sakusa's. He was taken advantage of and probably didn't even know how he felt himself. Sadness, anger, fear, all that was probably inside him. But I'm sure the way he helped you also helped him somehow. Atsumu hugged Sakusa a little tighter. I'm sure he loved you just as much as you did, Omi. I mean, how couldn't he? Sakusa clasped his hands in the back of Atsumu's sweater and hugged him even tighter. Atsumu ran one hand through Sakusa's curls to calm him but also himself down. His own eyes had filled with tears by now as well. Sakusa let a few more tears run down his face now, not wanting to let go of Atsumu. Achoo. It's okay, Omi. The two remained in the tight embrace for a while longer until Sakusa suddenly loosened his grip from Atsumu. His whole body became heavier and warmer. Atsumu knew Sakusa was exhausted. He already looked really tired after the night shift. Omi. You should rest and sleep. Sakusa was totally worn out. He didn't even realize what was happening around him. Atsumu carefully laid Sakusa's back on his bed and covered him up. He looked into his sleeping face, realizing that he had cried a little because his eyelids were slightly red. Atsumu frowned and swallowed. You don't deserve this, Omi. Atsumu made sure to darken every window in Sakusa's room so he could sleep in peace. Then he walked out of his room, pulled the door shut behind him, and leaned back against it. He let out a deep breath. Fuck. Atsumu just realized that he was shaking. Why am I so jealous? Over the next few weeks, Atsumu deliberately got up earlier so that he could spend the morning alone with Sakusa. It was kinda a routine for the two. As time passed by, their friendship grew closer and closer. He wanted Sakusa to tell him more about Yuki, mainly so Sakusa wouldn't lock his feelings inside. For Atsumu, this was relief and torture at the same time. Relief because he could really see Sakusa opening up to him more and how much better he felt since he started talking about his memories and feelings for Yuki. Torture because Atsumu was insanely jealous of Yuki. He really hated him for putting Sakusa through hell. In the meantime, Komori had a closer clue to Yachi's whereabouts. Since Sakusa was still involved in the plans of Eiko's father and Atsumu really wanted to be the one to talk to Yachi, it was Atsumu and Komori who were headed north. Haikyuu would stay with Sakusa for that time. Atsumu and Sakusa were just entering Sakusa's room as they talked about the upcoming plans. When are you leaving tonight? Komori wants to leave at 8 p.m. When are you going to Mr. Suzuki? 7 p.m. again? Sakusa nodded. I'll try to see you before you leave. Don't worry, Omi. If you can't make it, we'll see each other again in 2 weeks. The most important thing is that you get enough rest. Atsumu grinned at Sakusa and walked towards his bed. Sakusa also smiled weakly and looked at Atsumu. He let himself fall into Sakusa's bed, closed his eyes and enjoyed the soft ground beneath him. Everything smelled like Sakusa. He loved it. I swear, Omi, your bed is so much softer than mine. Sakusa giggled. He looked at the blonde boy who was getting comfortable in his bed, his heart beating faster and faster. Don't let Aiko hear that. Atsumu opened his eyes and raised an eyebrow. He straightened up so that he was now supporting himself with his elbows. Unfair. You always get a special treatment. Sakusa sneered and slapped his hands on his chest, pretending to be unbelievably horrified. Me. She practically adores you, Atsumu. Atsumu laughed. I am adorable. Atsumu smirked and twitched his eyebrows. Sakusa laughed and shook his head, lowering his gaze. Atsumu looked so stupid. So unbelievably stupid and cute. He whispered underneath his breath. You are indeed adorable, Achu. Atsumu blushed. He could have sworn that he had heard Sakusa call him adorable. Come on, Omi, it's time you catch up on sleep. Sakusa nodded and pushed the side of his fingers away from his forehead, giving Atsumu a yes-ir. Atsumu let a small smile escape his lips and made some space for Sakusa on the bed. Sakusa took off his shirt, revealing his bare torso. Atsumu blushed even more at that sight. He laid down in bed next to Atsumu and turned to his side. He propped his head up with one arm, a few of his black curls falling perfectly into his face. He looked at Atsumu and gave him a warm and tired smile. Atsumu sank into Sakusa's dark eyes, into the beauty of the man in front of him. Fuck. What are you doing to me, Omi? Atsumu could feel Sakusa's body heat and became a little woozy from it himself. He felt so incredibly comfortable and could go right back to sleep. You look tired, Omi. Sakusa closed his eyes and hummed. Atsumu ran his hand through Sakusa's dark curls, making him feel much more relaxed and tired. He smiled weakly and drifted further and further into sleep. With Atsumu he could just calm down instantly. Atsumu was a blushing mess. He smiled at Sakusa, admiring the sleeping man in front of him. He wanted to be loved by this man, but he knew that was impossible. Cause even though Yuki was dead, Atsumu knew Sakusa was still attached to him and Yuki was nowhere near within his reach. Atsumu could never replace him. Later that evening, Sakusa got ready to leave for Aiko's father. Before he left, he wanted to say goodbye to Komori and Atsumu. After all, he wouldn't see them for the next 2 weeks. Sakusa found Atsumu standing on the balcony, looking out into the growing darkness of the night. What's on your mind, Achu? Atsumu winced as Sakusa suddenly stood beside him. He had been so deep in his thoughts that he hadn't even noticed him. Atsumu looked into Sakusa's dark eyes, which stared at him expectantly. Oh, nothing important really. Atsumu turned his gaze away from Sakusa and stared a little sadly into the distance, supporting himself with his lower arms on the balcony railing. Sakusa frowned, noticing that something was wrong with Atsumu. Is it because of Yachi? Huh? Atsumu looked at Sakusa a little confused. Yeah. I guess I'm a little worried Atsumu faked a smile and rubbed the back of his head. It wasn't really about Yachi at all. Ever since Atsumu had found out a little more about Yuki and Sakusa's relationship with him, the memory of what Aiko had once said to him wouldn't let him go. Yuki resembled you very much. Bullshit. Atsumu frowned a little in annoyance. He really didn't want to be like Yuki in any way. It actually made him a little mad the longer he thought about it. I hope you will find them up there. Atsumu unconsciously agreed, completely ignoring what Sakusa was actually saying at the moment. In Atsumu's head there was only room for this one thought and it was driving him nuts. Hey Omi? Atsumu turned to Sakusa and looked him in the face. Sakusa froze as he saw how worried Atsumu seemed to be. Something was seriously wrong. Sakusa frowned. Am I really that similar to Yuki? Sakusa tilted his head and looked at Atsumu, perplexed. It took him some time to realize what Atsumu had just asked him. Then he burst out laughing, causing Atsumu's brow to furrow and leaving an absolutely annoyed expression on his face. PFFFT. What? Atsumu's facial expression became more and more annoyed. I dunno what's so funny about that. Hahaha Atsumu. Where did you come up with that now? Sakusa wiped away a few tears that had appeared from laughter and exhaled deeply to calm down again. Atsumu pouted. Aiko once said that to me. And I just wanted to know if it was true. Omi. Oh my gosh, stop laughing. Phew. Sakusa grinned, but really tried to calm down again as he saw how serious Atsumu was. He chuckled and leaned against the balcony railing. I actually think you're not like Yuki at all. Atsumu's eyebrows furrowed and he glanced at Sakusa, startled. Sakusa grinned at Atsumu, but then averted his eyes to look across the garden. Well, now that I think about it, you both continuously say what's on your mind. You're incredibly blunt and naive, and you're both really loud and annoying. Kiyoomi. Sakusa chuckled and gave Atsumu a warm smile. The first genuinely sincere warm smile in a long time. But otherwise, you're very different, Achu. Atsumu flinched and looked at Sakusa with his eyes wide open. Sakusa turned his gaze to the distance again. Although Yuki really cheered me up, there was always something about him, or rather between us, that dragged us both down. Sakusa smiled faintly. It's different with you. I feel like nothing can go wrong when you're with me, Achu. You're all here and you have a presence that makes everyone shine from the bottom of their hearts. That is really special, Achu. Atsumu blushed, lowered his gaze to the floor and smiled faintly. It relieved him to hear that. It relieved him to know that Sakusa just didn't see him the same way as Yuki. That he wasn't like the man who had caused Sakusa so much pain. Atsumu's eyes snapped in Sakusa's direction as he suddenly noticed Sakusa grabbing his wrist and pulling him towards him. He put his other arm around Atsumu's shoulders and placed his lips on Atsumu's, whom he now held tightly in his embrace. Atsumu's eyes were wide open, realizing what just happened. Sakusa kissed him. He was a blushing mess, but now returned Sakusa's kiss and fully engaged with him. The kiss was sweet, gentle and so sensitive. Atsumu wanted them to stay like that forever. He closed his eyes and enjoyed Sakusa's closeness, his warmth, his smell. Everything about him mesmerized Atsumu. His heart was beating faster and faster. His cheeks were dark red because they filled up with heat. After a few moments, Sakusa broke away from the kiss, which made Atsumu frown and leaving the two of them panting. Atsumu didn't want it to stop. Sakusa leaned in further and whispered in Atsumu's ear. You are really special to me, Achu. Sakusa gave Atsumu a small kiss on his cheek and then turned to walk away. He left Atsumu behind and didn't even look at him back anymore. Atsumu was totally perplexed and overwhelmed. He looked after Sakusa and saw the tall man walking away. Atsumu gently stroked his lips with his fingers. Did he? Atsumu's heart raced faster and faster. The butterflies in his stomach couldn't take it anymore. Atsumu swallowed. He had a huge lump in his throat. Did he just? Atsumu supported himself with one hand on the balcony railing and then slowly squatted down. He was shaking. He cupped his other hand over his mouth at this point and was now fully aware of what had just happened. Did he just kiss me?